This is Charlie Rose.
Chris Smith, Jon Stewart, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Tell me, we're going to talk about a lot of things, but I mean, this is The Daily Show, an oral history. Chris, why this? Why an oral history?
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, come on.
Why?
The title, If I Did It, was taken.
Yes.
So we had
Smart.
to go with an oral history. Because
Because it's an oral history.
yeah, and the voices of the people who wrote and performed this show are so interesting and are really not terribly well known outside of the 22 minutes a night that Jon and everybody else did for 16 years. Certainly Stephen Colbert has done interviews, Samantha Bee has done interviews. But the actual process, the making of the show, that wasn't something that was exactly kept secret, but it was kept close because Jon and everybody else was so focused on those 4 days a week and just getting it done, and that's a really hard job. That the actual process, the making of the show, the evolution, the growth, internally and externally, was a story best told by the people who lived it.
So you've got to go to Jon, you got to go to everybody else and say, will you do this? Will you cooperate? Instant for you, you said, yes, let's do it.
Yeah. Well, I've known Chris for a very long time, and I've always enjoyed his reporting because I thought it was always, it was never, he always came at things from a really thorough and fair. When you were reading his work in New York Magazine and in other places, it always felt invested, but not, purposefully pejorative. It was just really well done. And I thought, we were so involved over those 16 years, and people have always said, what was it like, man? And what was your favorite parts? And I was like, I don't know. But
So
I
you
thought
learned something. You learned something about
absolutely
the perspective of the guys that you were with,
Absolutely.
the men and women who made up the Daily Show.
Absolutely. And if it was going to be told, I want it told as thoroughly and as fairly, warts and all, as it could possibly be. And I thought Chris was a great reporter to be able to do that.
Over the 16 years, how did the show evolve? What did it become that it was not at the beginning?
In truth, I think the evolution of the show, we just became better at doing it. So it's not that it's, there's two separate things. It's what the show became and what people thought of the show and the outside perspective of it. And that was the thing that I think, I talked to Chris a lot about, which is you had to ignore. What we tried to develop was a decent internal barometer of what worked for the show and how well we could execute it. So, you could never look at a piece and go like, I don't know if this is Emmy worthy. And we're an Emmy award-winning show.
Yes, indeed. Yearly.
You had to try and keep your own morality and integrity as the beacon for where you wanted the material to go.
Was your instinct almost always right about what would be funny and what would not be funny?
I think we got better at that. There is something fragile about comedy and somewhat musical, and one man's meat is another man's pratfall. So I don't know. I can say that there were things that we wrote that I thought were really funny, where the audience might not.
Yeah.
And other things where you would do a joke, there'd be a pun that would come up with a shoulder, and the crowd would go a little bananas, and you'd just stop and you'd just kind of look at them like, really? Because we didn't think that was, we spent the whole day crafting this really beautiful comedic essay, but you just like the pun on the 007, huh? Okay.
In terms of the evolution of the show,
Yeah.
one of the things that was fascinating to go back and look at in great detail, people often forget the Daily Show existed before Jon arrived as host. Craig Kilborn was the host for close to 3 years. And they laid a really good foundation in some ways with the mock correspondence, the satire of news. The tone and the focus was very different. It was much more of a parody of local newscasts in a way. There could be a mean-spiritedness to some of the material. They were much more interested in celebrity and Hollywood and showbiz stuff.
Than political people.
Exactly, yeah. And it punched down at times in a way that could be funny, but was kind of ephemeral. And one of the things that was interesting in talking to Jon, talking to other folks who were there at the time when he came in 1999, is he knew he wanted it to be more substantive. But he didn't have a master plan. He didn't really have a blueprint of, okay, here's where we're going.
Yeah, you said I just wanted to last 9 months.
Yes.
You want to get, I've been fired enough. That was my general goal.
Do you know why you were successful this time? Was it the best extension of your talent?
I believe it was the best extension of what I know how to do. And perhaps I didn't necessarily know that at the time, but beyond that, cable is a very different animal, especially during that time, than network is. And so it has a different level of pressures and a different level of performance. You're able to use it as a laboratory in ways that you wouldn't be able to do on a network. A network lives or dies by the overnights.
Yeah.
Whereas in cable, they had this crazy deal worked out where they live and die by the carriage fee.
Yeah. They got two revenue streams
They
too.
got, and so their goal was to throw things out there. So I knew that we had more time, and I think maybe that allowed me a little bit more confidence to push it. And I had to push them as well, because it wasn't necessarily the direction that they wanted to go in.
But you were running the show too. I mean, you were there in the trenches.
I wouldn't refer to them as. If you have a craft services table, generally that is not trenches.
This was
trenches.
a recurring thing
This was
in
not
the
trenches.
reporting of the show.
So what was it?
Is the number of digestive metaphors that were involved in the creation of the Daily Show was at times uncomfortable.
So Chris, what did it become? It became, for all of us, a kind of cultural event.
Yeah, and that's interesting.
More than a show.
Yeah, and Jon started to touch on this too. It's easy to forget in 2016 what the media world looked like in 1996, 1997, 1999, where Comedy Central was, still kind of a sketchy proposition, where MSNBC and Fox News had just launched at the same time that The Daily Show was coming into being. Facebook didn't exist, and now it's had a major influence on an election, a presidential election.
Food came in frozen dishes, and you had to heat it by hand.
Right?
It was a different time, I say.
We just went through an election.
What?
Yes.
Yeah.
Your reaction to this election?
Surprise. Surprise.
Fear.
It all ties together. Well, fear, here's what I would honestly say. I don't believe we are a fundamentally different country today than we were 2 weeks ago, or than we were a month ago. The same country, with all its grace and flaws and volatility and insecurity and strength and resilience, exists today as existed 2 weeks ago. The same country that elected Donald Trump, elected Barack Obama. And those contradictions are, this election to me is just another extension of the long argument that we've had from our founding, which is what are we? And that's, are we an ideal, or are we some form of ethno-state? And that argument has existed so on a philosophical and theoretical level, I feel badly for the people for whom this election will mean more uncertainty and insecurity. But I also feel like this fight has never been easy. And I think it's odd. It's like we're a couple, and we met, and we had the first fight we had when we met was, look, the people on our money had slaves. Yeah. The people we honor had slaves. The people who wrote "All men are created equal" had slaves, and it's not like they didn't know it was wrong.
Many of them came from a slave-owning state.
Right. So the argument between rural and urban, between the ideals of inalienable rights and slavery, we've had the same argument over and over again. At times it's been more volatile, at times it's been more violent, but it's never been easy. And fighting for this, I don't see this as some form of end point. It's a continuation of a long battle to determine what we are. And I think it made me wonder, you know, one of the things that I think struck me odd about this election, and maybe I just missed it, was nobody asked Donald Trump what makes America great. And that was the part that what
He
are
wants
his...
to make America great again.
Yes.
Nobody said to him, well, what is it that makes America great?
Correct.
What is it you want to do
What is
that
the
we're not doing now?
What are the metrics?
Yeah.
Because it seems like, from listening to him, the metrics are that it's a competition and that it's wins and losses. We're going to win more. And is that what makes us great? And I think what many would say is what makes us great is America is an anomaly in the world. There are a lot of people, and I think his candidacy has animated that thought that a multi-ethnic democracy, a multicultural democracy, is impossible. And that is what America, by its founding and constitutionally, is. Like every other
it's
state.
becoming more and more,
Correct.
year by year.
Correct.
And
so
some people were worried that it meant different things for them,
Yes.
and that their life was changing because of that. And
Right.
there was a certain fear.
Oh, I think no question. The insecurities that people feel as marginalized populations are also felt. You know, a Rust Belt worker that lost his job in manufacturing feels an insecurity that, you know, you can say to them, but look at all the terrible things that he says, and they might say, you know, look, I live in an area that voted for him.
But the question then is, did Democrats and did Secretary Clinton open the door for Donald Trump because she did not or could not speak to them?
Whether or not she opened the door or not, I don't think it was her door to open. I think you're talking about a global issue, globalization and the pushback of that. Now, in ethno-states, it sort of makes more sense that we have an ethnic identity. But when you live in a state that's an ideal, well, then what is the bar of entry? The bar of entry is, I agree with you. People have inalienable rights, and you can, and that's, so can I come in? And as long as you behave within that manner. But let's not pretend that this isn't a battle that has been revisited time and time again, and that's why I feel we have a resilience to it that we have to continue to fight.
But do you think it's healthy that we have this now, that in fact this battle, this real sense of finding out who we are?
Yes, but I also
and
don't...
whether we have gone off track in some way.
Absolutely. You know, I think I would rather have this conversation openly and honestly than in dog whistles. You know, somebody was saying, there might be an anti-Semite that's working in the White House. And I was like, have you listened to the Nixon tapes? Like, forget about advising the president, the president. Like, have you read LBJ? Do you know our history? You know, this is, and we also have to caution ourselves to the complexity of that history. That I thought Donald Trump disqualified himself at numerous points. But there is now this idea that anyone who voted for him has to be defined by the worst of his rhetoric. And I think it's a big mistake. And I think that our relationship status with our own worst impulses is complicated. And you have to remember, who was the most progressive president maybe in our history who's lionized? It's Roosevelt, right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who also interned Asian Americans.
During World War II?
During World War II. So we are a complicated and real people. I know the hardest thing for me during this election was the disconnect I had between watching the rallies, which I think animates, generally because it's a rally, the wisdom of crowds is never particularly moderate. But to see Lock Her Up and shouting at the media and USA and some terrible things that happened, and his inability to in any way tamp that down, and in some cases inspire it, to view that with my own experience with real people that I knew were voting for Trump, who are friends of mine, who I don't tolerate because they're irredeemable and deplorable. I love. Like, there are guys in my neighborhood like that I love, that I respect, that I think have incredible qualities, who are not afraid of Mexicans and not afraid of Muslims and not afraid of blacks. They're afraid of their insurance premiums. And they have, and I this idea that, you know, that they represent, they have given tacit approval to a dictator and a madman, you know, look at your phone, man. Look at everything that we have. We make those kinds of compromises every day for exploitative purposes. I've gone on too long.
No, you haven't.
I get a little, you know, Charlie, I haven't had anybody to talk to about this in a
Yes,
while.
I know.
So it's a little.
You've come to the right place.
All right, I appreciate that.
Did you miss it during the campaign?
God,
did
no.
You did not for a second.
No.
You didn't want to be there.
No.
And being able to do what you just did. Tell us what you thought, both with satire and comedy and with reason.
No.
Not at all.
I didn't, no. Because impotent rage wears on you.
Meaning that you could be full of rage, but it wouldn't make any difference? Or
Correct.
somehow that
generally
is
almost
over.
any pursuit like this is any artistic pursuit, for whatever effect it has on its audience or things like that, is a relatively selfish pursuit. It's a catharsis for the individual, and it's a way to express ideas and get them out, and feel the seduction of it is it's going to score or it's not going to score. That's the hit.
Yeah.
That's the adrenaline. But what begins to wear on you is where it's taken. And I think this election could be a great lesson in that controlling the culture is not the same thing as power. And a viral video eviscerating racists is not the same as a grassroots movement that seeks to have common ground with people and create a multi-ethnic coalition that understands that other people's hierarchy of needs is not necessarily your hierarchy of needs.
Yes. But the idea of what The Daily Show became
Yeah.
Was not something that was banging around in your head when you took this job. Or was it?
Well, what was banging around in my head was, is there a better way to execute public affairs comedy that means something to me? If I'm going to spend this much time, I had hosted talk shows. I did one on MTV and I did one on like a syndicated.
Right.
And I was spending 12 hours a day on things that didn't feel substantial or meaningful to me. So this was a chance to, can I express my comedy about things that I care about in a way that's entertaining enough that I won't get fired, because I'd been fired. And when you get fired and your name is on the show, it's hard not to go, oh, you might suck at this. And you have to reevaluate, well, you know what? If I'm going to put myself in that position, then I'm going to lay it on the line. And I'm going to put out there what I care about. And it could get rejected,
Say,
but at least
if I go down, I'm
know.
going to go down doing it my way.
That's right. I'm going to go down the way I feel like I'm going to do it in the way that I think is the best iteration of my abilities. And if that goes down, you know, I can bartend.
What? Yes, you could. Was there a moment in which, was there a time, was there an event, whether it was a Florida recount, whatever, that you said, we got it, we have traction? I can be confirmed in my belief that what I was rolling the dice on has come up a winner.
No.
Not in terms of success, but in terms of the confidence that what I wanted to do and what I was insisting on doing has been.
I would say, and you've talked to a bunch of people about this.
Right.
I would say that it was never about like, it was more that would we be able to develop a process to do that well and it's the inherent juxtaposition of a creative pursuit, which is, can we build a machine that is redundant enough and rigid enough that it can sustain inspiration, improvisation, and creativity?
And 5 days a week.
Exactly.
Okay, but when did that happen then? The process kick in that you knew was the process. No.
I don't. Here's my problem.
You don't-
that wasn't my concern.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
Chris,
the process
that's why we have Chris
changed
here, isn't it?
and grew. And
When did that happen?
November 3rd? No.
Yeah.
No, but it
I don't
wasn't.
know.
Well, it really took shape through the 2000 campaign and the recount, the day-to-day process. Like John says, the technology eventually caught up with what The Daily Show was doing. They pioneered in some ways not just the form, but the assembly of these kinds of montages. What was equally important was not simply the process of, okay, we're having a meeting at 9 o'clock and we need these clips.
No. Yeah.
What they found early on was a tone to what they wanted to do. And while events went on in the outside world that changed what they thought, they found a tone in a piece Steve Carell did with John McCain on the Straight Talk Express in late 1999, where Carell does a preamble where he's chasing the bus and trying to get on the bus.
They wouldn't let us on there. They had a main bus, and then they had 2 press buses.
Yes.
Right.
One had very bad
Mainstream
food.
press.
Yeah, the other had a nicer,
I
had
see.
air conditioning.
Yeah.
And a bathroom.
Right. And they go to Cindy McCain, and Cindy McCain is appalled at the rollover bus conditions and says, okay, come on the main bus with John. And what you don't know from watching the finished piece is all the work that went into this. Right. And it became a prototype of how John shifted field pieces away from, in his phrase, abject cruelty to actual point of view. And Carell and the producer of that piece, a guy named Nick McKinney, had laid out a series of questions, and Carell is a world-class improviser.
Yes.
So that if
And a
you
world-class
ask,
talent.
Yes.
if you ask this question and he says X, here's how you respond.
Right.
The difficulty in this is one of many difficulties. Is you've got world-class improvisers working with civilians who don't know they're in an improv.
Yes.
You're doing a
Okay.
scene with someone who doesn't know
Yeah,
what they're doing
right,
a scene.
I got it.
So they develop all these questions of what they're going to ask McCain, and most of them are softball, like what kind of tree would you be? And what became famous at the end of that piece, and a turning point in the development of the show, was Carell asked McCain, Senator, you've been a strident opponent of pork barrel spending. How can you justify, when you were chair of the Commerce Committee, you okayed billions of dollars in pork barrel spending? And McCain freezes. There's a deer in the headlights moment. And then Carell bursts the tension by saying, oh, I was just joking. I don't even know what that means. Now, what was fascinating to me, and Carell had not remembered it until I talked to him, they found, McKinney and Carell found that question in Time magazine driving over to the shoot.
Right.
And that kind of structure and last minute
Right.
improvisatory genius was something John created that held throughout his run at the show.
But it also brings up an interesting, which is the crux of the Daily Show paradox, which is, in that moment, you hold to account a senator whose entire identity is based on a hypocritical behavior. I am against this type of pork barrel politics unless it benefits, and then I do an attack, right?
Unless it benefits
So
the
that,
good people of
hey
Arizona.
man, we nailed you, and then what do we have to do at that point? We let you go. It's catch and release, because we have to undercut it with a laugh, and it gets to the joy and frustration of doing that type of job, which is, and it's when we realize too that access didn't help us. So it's that idea of, I got you, and here's my one moment, and I'm going to, with a scalpel, go at the crux of your identity as a politician and expose it for everybody to see, and then I'm going to have to make a joke about it and walk away, and you're going to laugh, and it's going to humanize you. One of the difficulties of this is satire began to take the place of reality. I think this has been given a greater place in the discussion and a larger role in the discourse than is warranted. And once that started to happen, I think you began to question if it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I know it's not a black and white issue, but controlling the culture isn't, and for as much fun as like we could make at the Tea Party, like while we were up there passing around viral videos of eviscerations, they were in a Friendlies off a highway taking over a school board. And we just had an election where the Democrats won the popular vote by probably more than 1 million votes. And they don't control the presidency, they don't control the House, they don't control the Senate, they don't control governorships, they don't control state legislatures. This may be the largest disconnect between majority rule and majority power that we've had in this country in ages. And I'm in no way saying like, and we're responsible, and I'm responsible. But what I am saying is there is a comfort in culture that can be mistaken for real power. There's only 2 towns in the world that I've ever been in that I thought were delusional. One was Washington, D.C., but the other was Los Angeles. And the only difference between Los Angeles and Washington is in Los Angeles, they actually believe they have power. But D.C., like, that's where it is, man.
Yeah.
And the irony of this election...
D.C., they have power.
They have power.
L.A., they just believe they have power.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And when you go...
But
But
are
the
you
same arrogance exists.
Okay, but are you saying essentially that whatever we're saying about culture and the influence you had on the culture,
Yes.
in the end, it's not political power, and in the end,
Correct.
it's not.
And in the end, it's not real cultural influence, even. It's a story we tell ourselves about the rightness of our position. But it is argument, and it's not without weight, but it is not with so much weight. I believe that culture played a good role in marriage equality. I think it brought a story out that had been, so much of what occurs with inequality is ignorance. And I don't mean that in a malevolent way. I mean it in the way of, I have no experience with this. I don't know what that is. So exposure to that can be positive, although generally in an entertainment sense, the exposure is two-dimensional.
Okay, but do you think people came as guests?
Yes.
Because they, A, wanted the numbers you had, wanted to reach the audience you had?
Yes.
Or because they enjoyed it? It gave them a certain kind of sense of being part of something that was hip and in.
I will say they did not enjoy it.
Really?
Yeah, he might.
Chris?
He talked to them.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, Chris Wallace of Fox News said almost exactly those words to me, that his kids were never more impressed with him than when he went on The Daily Show.
Yeah.
And it felt like you'd been invited to become a member of a hipper club.
And you had the ticket to that club. That's power.
To a club.
Yeah.
It's power in the way that a bouncer has power.
Now-
right? Yes, I was a bouncer.
Well, I was thinking
you're
about that.
absolutely
You're
right.
right.
I
You
was a
were a
bouncer
bouncer.
at a club that
were.
did pretty well
You
for a
were,
while.
yeah.
But I got to tell you, man, drive down 14th Street, down by 2nd Avenue. Palladium ain't there anymore.
Well, and I walked
Yes,
by.
that's
Do you know what I mean?
There's no Studio 54.
It's
That's
a
right.
condo now.
Right. And
Exactly.
on the way over here, I walked past Fox News World Headquarters.
Yes.
And there's a marching band, there's dancing girls, there's free Jell-O shots.
Yeah.
Apparently they won.
But speaking of Fox News, it was the gift that kept on giving.
It was not the gift that kept on giving. It was the relentless offerer of. They were a good foil because they were offering cynicism, which they continue to offer. There is no more cynical enterprise than Fox News. Now, forever they want to say about the liberal media,
Or fair and balanced.
which may be the most cynical expression of any slogan in the history of slogans. That's like if Coca-Cola went out there and their slogan was healthy vitamins for children. Like it's completely not that. Fox News is reactionary in the way that, by the way, The Daily Show is reactionary.
Yeah.
In the way that a lot of this new media is a reaction to what they see as either unfairness or something hidden.
Okay, but did you see what you were doing as simply offering an alternative to what Fox is saying because...
No.
Okay, go ahead.
We saw it as, so the headline for it on Huffington Post would be, Stewart eviscerates arguments against gay marriage.
Yes.
And we would think of it as, Daily Show comes up with a somewhat humorous look at what they think is a hypocritical stance on personal freedoms. And that's the weight that it should be given.
But you licked your chops when you saw hypocrisy like you hadn't seen before. I mean, when you saw them, if you thought it was hypocritical, that would be the point where you would just say.
It was animated by visceral feelings, no
Yeah.
question. Yeah, because that's the stuff that, this show is basically just, if you imagine in general, and I hate to do this to your audience, and I don't know if this is PBS, so you want to do a trigger warning, but The Daily Show was a satirical expression of me sitting in my underwear yelling at the television. And now I just get to go back to doing that. Except now I'm surrounded by farm animals.
There's a point in the book where a lot of different people, among them a guy named Jon Stewart, who has been a leader in pushing for health care for 9/11 first responders.
Does the Feel Good Foundation. And
Right. They walk us through what John and others did to get the permanent extension of the Zadroga bill a little while back. And John at one point...
I think that's where I saw as much passion from you on a issue.
Yeah, which, we can debate influence and power. There were points where The Daily Show had real impact, real world impact, and, John does not get up and raise his hand and say, I did that, but, there are a lot of first responders who are going to have their medical bills paid
because
in large
he was
part
able to cast
of his focus on this. But in that discussion, John, at one point in the book, says, in some ways, the debate over Zadroga is what The Daily Show, for me, was all about. A lot of people looking at something in a common sense way and saying, isn't this crazy that this isn't getting done? Why isn't this happening? And I think...
It was a common sense argument.
Yes, and I think he and the show were ahead of the curve, and people talk about this in the book, in recognizing on the left and the right how government was not functioning for a lot of average Americans. And they pointed that out in all sorts of ways, from the healthcare debate to the government shutdown, to minimum wage, all sorts of things over the years.
To the
Katrina,
Obamacare stuff.
Yeah.
yes. And at one point, there's a former correspondent named Dan Bacadal, who wasn't on the show a long period of time, and in some ways had a very unhappy experience there. But in some ways, people who've had unhappy experiences think deeper about what worked and what didn't. And Bacadal talks in there about how he doesn't think Bernie Sanders would have been possible if not for The Daily Show. That there is a generation of people who grew up thinking about government and hypocrisy and politicians in terms that John and The Daily Show defined. I think that's true in a media sense, too, that you've got a lot of younger reporters who grew up watching The Daily Show. And in this campaign, maybe it was too little, too late. Maybe it was more print than TV. But can we
Yes,
curse?
we can say
we
anything.
curse?
Yes.
There were a lot of people in this campaign who called bullshit.
But you can
Right.
curse.
And, annotating lies, footnoting every lie in a Donald Trump speech was something that John and The Daily Show had done with Bush, had done with Obama all along. And that kind of thing, you can point to filtering through
Yeah, you've
the
got it,
media
Rick. Go ahead.
culture.
But you have to meet force with force. And The Daily Show is what I would say we are. And again, I'm not saying this to denigrate what we did. I am so incredibly proud of, this was the best iteration of, for me, what I could do with satire, and we prosecuted it to its fullest extent as far as I was concerned, as far as my brain could go. One of the reasons I left is I was just going to be redundant and keep going back and forth with the same thing. I'm gonna really do a terrible analogy. but we were Patrick Swayze after he died in Ghost. We were in the subway yelling at dead people and raging, and no one could hear us. But if we focused everything that we had in one moment, at just the right time, at just the right moment, with everything we had, we can move the can just a little bit. Did you see
Yes.
that? Okay. You want to talk about the pottery scene? No. Let's just. But do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we're impotently raging the thing. Zadroga was 10 years of backbreaking labor by John Field and these first responders. It was corruption at a government level at the highest order that could be done. It was the people that had been hailed as heroes that ran into burning buildings that were told by our government, the EPA, that the air was safe, but the air was not safe. They are dying. They continue to die to this day. They were forced, with all their afflictions, to go down and, hat in hand, knock on doors to people who wouldn't even meet their eyesight. And those 10 years of working, they did all the construction. And at the very end, Cindy Lou Who came in with just a little star and went bink, and got way more credit for it than was deserved. They deserve that and continue to. And the ultimate irony of this election is the cynical strategy of the Republicans, which is our position is government doesn't work. We're going to make
Drain
sure
the
that it
swamp.
doesn't work.
Drain the swamp.
But they're not draining the swamp. McConnell and Ryan, those guys are the swamp. And what they decided to do was, I'm going to make sure government doesn't work, and then I'm going to use its lack of working as evidence of it. Donald Trump is a reaction not just to Democrats, to Republicans. He's not a Republican. He's a repudiation of Republicans, but they will reap the benefit of his victory in all of their cynicism and all of their, I will guarantee you Republicans are going to come to Jesus now about the power of government. They are going to suddenly realize that, you know what? Government authority is it's actually not tyranny when we've won it. It's actually authority, and it's consent to the people. And you know what? Do you want an infrastructure project? And let me give you that and tax cuts. And let's see how far we can take that.
Okay, but here's
and that's
what-
the irony of it.
I mean, when we began this conversation, you were arguing that this country's had a long and tortured history
Yes.
of dealing in back and forth on these debates.
No,
And-
not on that debate. On race. That's a different
Oh,
debate.
just on race.
I'm talking about the foundational creed of the country, which is we are not, originally we were just white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and then like with immigration,
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant men.
white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. So look, here, you know who symbolizes the complexity and frustration of this country is probably almost more than anybody, Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was a suffragette. She fought desperately for women. She is a hero. When people were voting for Hillary, she was putting stickers on her grave and all that. But she was also, I think, steeped in racism and did not want black men to vote before women got to vote because that wouldn't have been fair to her because white women, white is better than black men.
Yes.
So it's, those are the inherent contradictions. Does that negate all the good that she did? Of course not. But it tells the story with the complexity that it deserves and hopefully allows us to see each other more clearly and have an empathy and compassion for the complexity of people's, hierarchy of needs and not negate people for the worst statement that they've ever did. Or in the liberal community, you hate this idea of creating people as a monolith. Don't look at Muslims as a monolith. They are the individuals, and it would be ignorance. But everybody who voted for Trump is a monolith, is a racist. That is, again, like that hypocrisy is also real in our country. And so this is the fight that we wage against ourselves and each other because America is not natural. Natural is tribal. We're fighting against thousands of years of human behavior and history to create something that no one's ever, that's what's exceptional about America, and that's what's, like, this ain't easy. It's an incredible thing.
And one of the things I hope the book does is illustrate that in some small way. John and the show made, over the course of the years as the show evolved, a very determined attempt to diversify the ranks from
Sure.
off camera
Yeah.
to on camera. And near the end of Jon's run there was a little hubbub about a confrontation he had with one of the correspondents, Wyatt Cenac,
Yeah.
African American.
I remember.
Yeah.
And we go into some detail about how and why that happened.
Yes.
And I think it's a fascinating illustration of how people of good intention, of strong values, these are tough things to wrestle with day in and day out in
Yes.
workplaces and creative environments. And a fascinating total coincidence. When this Wyatt Cenac story broke publicly, Ta-Nehisi Coates happened to be Jon's guest that day. Okay, Ta-Nehisi Coates, friend of Wyatt Cenac, wasn't aware of any of this backstory. I interviewed Coates for the book, and he said, I thought something really interesting. He said, you know, people struggle with racism in good ways all the time that we don't see and hear about. We hear about the confrontation, the conflict. And to him, yeah, what Jon did over the course of a number of years sometimes didn't make everybody happy, but was moving the ball forward, was of good intention and progressive in every way.
To create diversity there.
Yes. When you are faced with that type of criticism, your first response is generally defensiveness.
Right.
And that's what when we first started the show, comedy was especially late night, was the realm of late night ironists. Just very, very witty, and people did very well in the SATs and all went to the same, and wrote for their ribald parody papers at their colleges.
Right.
And the room was populated with a variety of relatively unathletic white men.
Who love sports.
Who did not love sports. And you would find, usually I'd have one guy, I'd be like, you see the Giants game last night? Yes. And then we would go back to the Marvel universe. When you are in it, sometimes the systems that perpetuate different forms of either racism or patriarchy or any of those things, you don't even realize you're in it when you're in it, right? And you certainly don't think that of yourself. So an article came out that said they don't have any women writing for the show, and on and on about that sort of thing. And my first response to it was, they don't understand. There are women here, they're empowered. This is not a sexist environment. I was raised by a single mother. Like, I went through every little, who do they think? And there were things in the article that I thought were like cheap shots, and what do they do? And then I sat in the writer's room and I looked around and I was like, oh, we're all just white dudes. It's like various forms of like facial hair. Like, I took that as diversity. What I looked at the metrics of diversity in a writing staff was, that guy's a one-line guy. He can write some great one-liners. That guy thinks more in terms of structure. That guy's a pretty good narrative guy. This guy's crazy. We're going to stay out of his way. But every 3 weeks, he's going to say something, and we're going to go, that's great.
Hey, that justifies your existence.
Right. So we had a policy at the show that you don't put your name on your submissions. And we thought that's what made us progressive. But what we forgot was, the system doesn't funnel you women. It funnels you the same people it had been funneling for 20, 30 years. It's a self-perpetuating system. So if I call a bunch of agents and go, I'm looking for writers, they're going to send me 100 white male writers. Now, I'm not going to look at their names because I don't want to be prejudiced. But what you forget is, change is effort. And it's not effort for effort's sake. It's effort because it makes the show better, stronger. Different viewpoints are what gave the show strength. So what we had to say is, by the way, thank you for sending those things. Send me your women.
Right.
Get me those submissions, please. The same with when we're adding correspondence. But you have to do that actively, and you deserve no credit for that. But it is, you have to a large extent, inertia is tacit in its complicity with a system.
And by doing so, you're ignoring a half of the population.
And you're not getting the best stuff.
Exactly.
Right, and this is something it was certainly not publicly known. Jon, in a variety of respects over the years, felt the need, okay, I'm going to be out there talking about veterans, I'm going to make jokes. I should go to the VA and actually talk to some veterans and see what they think.
So what did you do? Did you leave that aha moment in the writer's room?
No, this is all.
Did you change
it's
immediately?
gradual.
Did you go in there and say, look,
because everybody
I realize
everybody has blind spots, and it is very hard to overcome your own ignorance. And that's what I had to face in myself, which is, it's gut-wrenching sometimes.
Do you think, because of all this meant, and you found the right expression, as the word I used earlier, that you can find something that's equally right for you again? Or do you just simply hit a home run there? You found the perfect place for you, and it was 17 years of...
Yes. And I'll never have that again, but I shouldn't. Like, it was a gift that I was fortunate enough to be graced with for all that time and to be in contact with all those incredible people. But I don't expect to find that again. But what I've found is a more balanced existence where there's a difference between satisfaction and joy. This gave me great satisfaction, and it gave me great confidence, but joy, driving a couple of knucklehead kids home from school that I get to sit and listen, joy. And you need to have that as well, and this was an obsession that I think to be able to do it as well as we did, to me felt like the only way that we could do it, but at a certain point you have to hang up your cleats and go, I got out of this more than anybody, my cup runneth over, and it's time to cede that to someone else whose enthusiasm and vigor and intellectual curiosity will carry this forward and evolve it in new ways and bring it to a place that it needs to be that I am incapable of doing.
Did you find that joy in making movies?
Work is work. People say like, oh, when you're not working, man, when something happens and you're not at work, do you think like, oh, I wish I was at work? And you're like, has that ever happened to you in your life? Where you're not at work and you think to yourself like, oh, wow, I just heard there was I work in a bar and I just heard a busload of people came in looking for drinks. Man, I wish I was back there.
What's the most unusual insight from the book, from all these interviews? I mean, all the people that were part of the Daily Show family that you had the privilege to talk to and to get their sense of what was going on?
I don't know that unusual so much as striking that so many of the people working there were unaware is too strong, but didn't realize or didn't take in how much the outside world was paying attention, because the grind of actually doing the show day in and day out and the ethos that Jon set was, we're not running around saying, we've won all these Emmy Awards, aren't we speaking truth to power? It was about showing up and doing the best show that day possible. That sure, they knew people were paying attention, they knew, they'd go out to the Emmys and accept awards, but the ability to stay in the moment of the creation of the show, to me, was really kind of surprising.
You do accept this idea that because of the audience, even people who said it was their source of news,
right,
as you know, but were influenced by the Daily Show in terms of their curiosity, in terms of a mindset, and that those young people especially are going out now doing things, really interesting stuff. And they have been influenced by you.
Right.
As a teacher has an influence.
If it stimulated a curiosity for people to make arguments, if it stimulated a curiosity for people to look behind the veil of what is seen publicly and try and deconstruct what they see on television and what they see in political campaigns, I would consider that an incredible compliment to the show and to the legacy.
And to you.
As my name was on it.
Yeah.
But I would also caution anybody into, like, that it did come from our perspective. And there were a lot of people out there who thought it was unfair. And, you know, one of the big things people say is like, oh, when people push back, you say, oh, I'm just a comedian. I never really said that.
I can't claim to have seen and heard every utterance of Jon's in 20 years, but I'll vouch for that. He never said, I'm just a comedian. He took responsibility in all kinds of ways for the point of view as well as the jokes.
And the material. But I think it came from on Crossfire. You know, I'm on Comedy Central. But the point of that is not to say, this is comedy, it doesn't matter. The point of it is to say that the language of satire is different than the language of news and the language of media. That our weapons are hyperbole and satire and hard juxtapositions that are a cudgel when news media might use a scalpel. But that we stood by our arguments. And when our arguments were wrong, or if we thought, you know what, that was unfair and we did take that out of context, we had to own it and apologize for that kind of thing, because that's not the intention. The intention was not to propagandize. The intention was to see if you could make your argument in a really interesting and smart way that was funny, but that was also like as unassailable as it could be on the facts.
What you come away with, both from the book and from this conversation, is that comedy and satire ain't easy. It's hard. And the pursuit of it is a daily demand and requires a process.
I think what I tried to come out of it is excellence is hard, and competence is hard, and the pursuit of that is that process, and that whether it be satire or whether it be interviews or whether it be news, is that, you know, every artist that I've ever really admired, and I delve into their process, it's always the same. It's always deconstructive, somewhat obsessive, and intentional. And I think you can translate that ethos, not just to satire, but to any profession that people would go in. And if your aim is to challenge yourself and be excellent and improve and truly try and, you know, one of the things I hated about the movie reviews that I got was that they came out after the movie. Because you'd read through it, and so some of it you thought was unfair, but every now and again you'd hit something and go like, God, why didn't that guy tell me that before? That's right. You have to be able to handle and synthesize constructive criticism, because that's what makes you better. All processes are drafts. First draft, second draft, third draft, revision. And that's what I feel like. It's just a methodology that you can apply to anything that's done. That's why I have great admiration for people who excel at what they do, because I know what goes into it. Nothing is an accident.
The book is The Daily Show, the book. An oral history is told by Jon Stewart, the correspondents, staff, and guests. Written by Chris Smith, forward by Jon Stewart. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
For more about this program and early episodes, visit us online at pbs.org and charlierose.com.